Welcome to the Excellence in Training Academy, where traders come to grow at excellenceintrainingacademy.com. I'm very pleased to back with us this week Dr. Geoff Desmoulin. Geoff is the principal at GTD Scientific Inc. GTD offers biomechanical consulting services on behalf of clients throughout North America and abroad. Focused practice areas include injury biomechanics, incident reconstruction, and physical testing, with a subspecialty in the science of violence. Geoff has 2 degrees in kinesiology and 2 in engineering, giving him a unique skill set for understanding human injury from a biomechanical perspective. He combines this with his firsthand encounters with injury as an emergency medical technician, firefighter, karate black belt, and former engineering expert on Viacom's hit TV series Deadliest Warrior. Most importantly, when finding answers, Geoff draws on over 15 years of practical, hard-earned experience gained while investigating a wide range of criminal and civil cases, as well as research projects that enabled Geoff and his team at GTD to further expand their knowledge base. So, Geoff, welcome back to the Excellence in Training Academy.
Thanks for having me back, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Now, you're always doing new things and on the cutting edge of this field. And you did a presentation at the 2023 ILEETA conference called Biomechanics Analysis from Body-Worn Cameras. And we're going to talk about that today. And just the first 2 lines from your class description says, video is the most prolific form of forensic evidence. Hence, this course aims to identify how physics related to a complex human injury can be provided when the violent incident or portions thereof have been captured in a camera frame. And so I think there's a lot that I know I really enjoyed your presentation, learned a lot. There's a lot that you can pull from video that most of us are completely unaware of.
Exactly.
And so can you talk about some of those key elements and some of the things around, say, shape recognition, body orientation, positioning, and force that you can pull from video through some of the different ways that you analyze it?
Would love to, Brian. I mean, historically, no one's going to argue with me when I say that video is the most prolific form of forensic evidence these days. However, I don't believe it's being utilized to its maximum potential, in that most of the time there'll be a qualitative analysis. So someone will watch the video and just decide what it is that they've seen. The next step that's typically done is you'll get a timing analysis where someone will have, if you're lucky, interrogated the video and come up with the frame duration or frame rate. And then from the number of frames over whatever's happening, they'll come up with some timing. And if it gets really advanced, some people are talking about distances. So you might have a scale in the frame. Let's say, like if I was to just use your image now, if I knew one of those frames on your back wall there, if I knew what that dimension was, I could scale the entire room from that. And so people are doing things like that. So now you've got timing, you've got distance, and distance over time is actually velocity, right, or speed. And so this is how things have progressed as people get more and more competent with video footage. Now, what I'm finding, though, is that's where it stops in most cases. They'll get timing, they'll get distance, they'll get velocity, and then it stops. And they'll make all of their decisions based on that. And I thought, as a biomechanist, how can we take this one step further? And what can we offer this prolific form of video, of forensic evidence? And so one particular file was the Stefan Clark file, where we had some video footage from the corner of the house where Stefan was. There was a moment of time there where Stefan Clark wasn't moving and the officer's body-worn camera wasn't moving, and it happened to be just prior to the officer yelling "gun, gun, gun" and then shots firing out. So it was obviously a critical moment, and we started to think, like, how can we extract more information here? And we realized that one thing that was fairly clear in that video was at least Stefan Clark's outline. And this became a source of discussion internally, and what can we do with this, and what methods exist that we can apply to these literally 10 frames that we had to work with that were still enough to be useful and happened to be at a key moment in time in the incident. And excuse me. And we started doing some research, and what we realized is that machine vision or shape recognition, so getting robots to recognize objects, was a big deal in that field, but had never been utilized, at least to our knowledge, in forensics. And so we started looking at those methods, and we realized there was probably about 16 different ways to do this. About 5 of them had been recognized as being the most reliable, and then one of them was the easiest to implement, and that's what we chose, and that was the house door method. And really all it is it's a way to turn an outline into recognizing an object. And so we could now compare different shapes of people in different positions and compare that to Stefan Clark's outline. And anyways, what we found was that it was consistent. The algorithm consistently came up with a shooting posture that was consistent with the officer's statements. And that's something that you can't necessarily see with the naked eye. And we all know that what the officer is seeing is not necessarily what the body-worn camera is picking up. And so that was a huge advancement for that file. This file ended up settling, by the way, because it was a political hot potato, but that write-up went public. The city of Sacramento was very happy to go public with that information to help explain their officers' actions, and so we're super pleased that we could assist.
So through the technology, and it seems to me from your presentation that there's a need for somebody with a deep background in biomechanics, as well as an understanding of the technology and access to some technology that can be fairly expensive to work through some of these things. But you were, based on that shape from those 10 frames of that video, you were able to look at that. And then how did you compare it? Did you put other people in a variety of postures with their hands and arms in different positions, and then compare those outlines to see which one is most like? Or can you talk a little bit about the process, how you came to that?
Of course. First of all, we wanted to know if this was going to be a method that would be helpful. So the first thing that we did is we had 2 different people, one of them in a relaxed shooting posture, and that was our test subject, if you will. And then we compared that to a completely different person in 4 different positions, 3 different shooting positions. So one that would be more close to the chest, hands about halfway out in a relaxed shooting posture, and then something that would be in a fully elbows extended posture, and then just a simple checking your phone posture, where I'm kind of looking down, checking my phone, maybe typing a message, something like that, and just to see if the algorithm could tell the difference between those 2 different people in those 4 postures. And sure enough, it was able to show that the relaxed shooting posture was the most likely posture of our test subject, and that did match the test subject's posture. So we're like, oh wow, this is really quite robust and really quite interesting. And so maybe now we should expand this idea and apply it to the file, because we can't know the position of Stefan Clark. We can't get inside the brain of the officer to explain to us what he actually saw. All we have is those 10 frames to work off, and in fact, you can't see the hands. And so what we needed to do then was we went out and recruited a subject of the same height, the same skin tone, and we tried to create as many postures as possible that could be possible within the confines of the situation. So there was a number of hand positions, like even just, he was wearing a hoodie at the time, so just hands in his hoodie pocket, because we know it was a little bit cold that night. There was 3 different shooting postures. There was a hands up, 2 different hands up postures, because we know that the officers were instructing him to show him his hands. Excuse me. And there was 9 different postures of various benign positions, as well as I think just 3 shooting postures. And again, the algorithm came up with the relaxed shooting posture, or I should say it was shooting stance fully extended was the most likely position Stephon Clark was in. And so now we had this preliminary test result that showed that the algorithm could match 2 different subjects. And now we have 9 different postures, and the algorithm is still telling us that the fully extended shooting stance was the most likely position Stephon Clark was in, which of course was consistent with officer statements. And that was really quite remarkable, and something that we were really excited about and have now published, of course.
It seems to me that, I mean, this is a critically important work on your part, because what we have is we have a subject who is now deceased after this shooting. The officer is saying that they believe that the subject was pointing a weapon at them. They're in a backyard in a very low light conditions at night. And what's found afterwards is a cell phone and not a gun. And the family then and certain groups within the community are saying, well, all he was doing is holding the cell phone in front of him, and you shot him when he just had a cell phone, and that's not a justified shooting. And again, the video, when we look at the video, it's inconclusive because, as you say, because of the quality of videos. So is that why this is so important, that it takes the video analysis to a whole new level from a scientific perspective, that this is now not just speculation on somebody's part, but this is with the greatest certainty possible based on this advanced technology?
I'd say we're getting there. One thing I really like is that we didn't have to rely on officer statements. Also, there was no interpretation on behalf of myself as an expert, which is also a really strong case in this matter. Now, we're trying to collect more data on this. For example, we've approached Axon for a very small research grant that we can collect data on this, because what we really need to do is create some descriptive statistics without getting into what that means. Just we need more repeatable analysis doing this exact same setup, rather than having a single subject matching an unknown shape from Stephon Clark. Do you see what I'm saying? So we need to collect more data to be what I would call beyond a reasonable doubt, or 95% confident in our results. But it's looking very, very promising, and it's something that I think Axon should be interested in, and anyone analyzing a similar file should also be interested in.
Excellent. So do you see how do you see this playing out in the future then? I mean, obviously this takes a great deal of expertise that GTD Scientific brings to the field, a very unique expertise that you and your staff bring. What are some of the other areas where you see this potentially being of extreme value to the triers of fact when they're making decisions about some of these cases that in many cases are very emotionally charged and in the eyes of some very controversial?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there. They are very emotionally charged, politically charged, as we all know. And a technique like this, unfortunately, it does take the ability to interpret engineering literature, scientific literature, the ability to program computers. Like that was things that we needed to do on this file. It's relatively simple because it's been done before. It's been done in different industries. We're just applying it to a very specific situation here. However, I can tell you, once you get there, it's objective. And it's objective to the point where it would be very powerful in the court of law. So in certain situations where shape becomes an important part of an investigation, or interpreting that shape this is where I would turn, and I would encourage the industry to turn. Unfortunately, there is some technical components to it that may not be mainstream, but certainly the techniques are out there, and there's people out there that can apply them for you.
So you mentioned that it takes expertise to interpret the scientific data, but the end result required no interpretation on your part. And so can you just explain that a little more? Split those two
Sure.
areas out.
That's a good question, actually. What I mean by that is the methodology had been published. So what I mean is the Hausdorff method, the Hausdorff distance, that methodology on how to apply that to a shape was published. So that, I guess, algorithm, if you will, needs to be read, needs to be understood, needs to be implemented in a computer program. However, once that's been interpreted, then you can now apply that methodology to whatever shape of interest. So that's kind of what I mean by that is you need to search the literature. Like I said, there was about 16 different methods. We narrowed it down to 5, and we chose the easiest to implement. So even just doing that takes some expertise and ability to weed out what might be most appropriate for the file.
Now, is the shape recognition piece that you looked at in this case, is that something that would probably be most applicable in low light environments like the Stefan Clark case, where it's even from the video, it's not necessarily clear, or it may not be clear as video advances, and video has a greater ability to discern clarity in low light conditions than the human eye does. Is this something where this would have greatest application in low light, or is there application in that you can anticipate in a multitude of situations?
I think there's utility here for almost any situation that you can't see the hands, whether it's light or night. If you can't see the hands, you need to be able to understand from the shoulders and the elbows what those hands are doing, because we all know that the hands are the deadly part of any human being. And so if we understand what those hands are doing, we can better interpret what that human was doing.
Excellent. So shape recognition is one of the things that you can do through this biomechanics analysis from video. One of the other things that you talked about in your presentation was body orientation and position from video. Can you talk a little bit about the body orientation and position and the applications for that?
Absolutely. If you have a look on our website, we have manuscripts or we have publications in scientific literature that specifically focus on what we call inverse photogrammetry. And inverse photogrammetry is nothing overly new, but I think the way that we're using it and what we get from it is an expansion of what's currently being done. So what I mean by inverse photogrammetry is, just say, for example, I take a video or a photograph from my cell phone. That photograph or those series of images has a specific frame, and it captures certain items within that frame. And if I know something about that environment, for example, if I go scan it and I know all the three-dimensional locations of what was captured by that phone, I can run algorithms, which is inverse photogrammetry, to determine the location of that cell phone at the time those images were captured. And that becomes really, really useful. If you think of body-worn cameras, for example, we all know that officers can wear them in the center of the chest, upper left, upper right. I've seen them on top of the shoulders. And so even though they're generally getting the same scene, if we can figure out where that body-worn camera is, and we know where it's mounted to the officer, then we have a general idea as to the body orientation and the physical location of the officer at the time those frames were captured by the camera. And that becomes super critical because you can't always, I think people assume that what body-worn camera is doing is capturing what's happening beyond the officer's reach. And that's true, it is. but we're also capturing a lot of information about the body orientation and physical location of the officer wearing that camera as well.
So would this be then helpful for determining, so the officer's memory or recollection of where they were or how far away they were or where they were in relation to vehicles or subjects? We know that there's human memory is certainly imperfect from all of those, but using this this technique of this inverse photogrammetry, are you then able to take those frames and say, based on the position of this vehicle, based on the buildings in the background, this is where this officer was or these other people were in this particular event? Is that how it works?
Yes, and I wouldn't say that it's an assist to the officer memory. That's something that would be outside the scope of my expertise. But we could actually just tell them, you know, here's where you actually were during this point in time, and whether or not that jives with their memory is kind of a whole nother
Right.
bag of goodies. But the way we applied this specifically is because we were interested. This was applied to a case down in San Diego in which a homeless person had ripped the holster right off the gun belt of an officer when the RTI, or the rapid transition interface, had failed. And we wanted to know, well, where was that gun at that time, and how might that person have grabbed it? And because we didn't really know, and was it by the handle, was it by the, was it two-handed, was it single-handed, was it by the holster itself pulling up, or was it by two-handed on the pistol grip and pulling down, or was it more of a torque? It's just, we just had no clue. And so we use inverse photogrammetry here to figure out where that officer was, and we could see several limbs. We had the left foot and both hands of the officer in the frame, which gave us a very good indication as to where he was located. And then we also had the right hand of the person that he was struggling with. And so that left the left hand. And from that, we could figure out what the most ergonomic way the left hand could grab a hold of that weapon. And that's what we tested. And once we finished testing, we realized that the audio and the failure of the RTI fell in line, or was consistent with all the evidence in that case. And so we felt that that was the most likely, the most likely position it was, the officer was disarmed in.
So and to go back to the memory piece, I wasn't suggesting that we use this to enhance the officer's memory, but this seems like a critical piece of the investigation, and ultimately for the triers of fact, that the officer's perception is this. The subject may be saying something else. Other people are saying something else. People might be misinterpreting what they believe they see in the video. And so now what you're doing from a scientific perspective is saying this is the most likely way that this happened based on all of this information. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. And in fact, so what we try to do is, once we know where the camera is in three-dimensional space, then they're usually good departments will take photographs of their officers after an incident like this. And so we'll know where that body camera was mounted. And so we can now take three-dimensional models that are scaled to the officer's height and weight, and literally place him in line with where that camera was located through inverse photogrammetry. And from there, we can start to piece together the entire environment in a logical, or I should say, in a way that is based in logic, or rooted in logic.
So are you
in other words,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, if you know where the camera is and you know where it's mounted to the officer, and you can see his limbs in the frame, that's pretty good indication as to where we would need to position our three-dimensional model to represent what's going on behind the camera.
Now, are you able to use the same technique with other camera views other than just a body-worn camera? So again, much as the officer may or may not have body-worn camera, there may be in-car video, there may be cell phone video, security camera video. Are you able to use these same techniques using video from other sources other than the body-worn camera as well?
Yes, we've done dash cam, we've done halos, we've done cell phones, we've even done an iPod. And that was interesting because the officer, the vehicle that was being shot at, and the person holding the iPod were all three of those were moving. But there was enough information in each frame that we could essentially treat each frame individually and then link them together to kind of show what was happening in 3 dimensions. So it's really remarkable. And that all started with inverse photogrammetry as to where that iPod was in that 3 dimensional space.
So from using the inverse photogrammetry, you're able to compare some of those frames, and then you create a 3D replication of the incident based on that, showing based on this information, this is where it's most likely that everybody was located. This is where the officer was. This is where the vehicle that maybe they shot into was. This is where the person was that was taking the video.
100%. That's exactly what we do, Brian. And not only do we do that with known errors. So based on these techniques, because every technique has an error associated with it. And so we can track those errors and measure them and then communicate them along with that 3 dimensional representation of what we think happened.
And so this allows the investigators or the court to look at the physical evidence, maybe where the rounds entered the vehicle and the angles, and compare it to this to come to a reasonable conclusion as to what most likely happened, even though there may be conflicting perceptions or testimony from people involved from different perspectives.
100%. And I like to think that I remove myself as much as possible in the sense that typically everything we rely on will be based on some piece of information. And if we don't have information to back it up, then we can't say that that's true. If it follows with a narrative, we can say it's consistent with, but we won't ever say that that's true unless we have some basis for it. And if there's a basis for it, there'll be an attached error rate in either the optical axis or across the screen. So it's very powerful information, and sometimes the lawyers we're working with don't always want to hear it because it's not consistent with what their officer is saying, or vice versa. It's something that they really needed and didn't know they could get. So either way, we're just running our investigation and supply them with the most accurate information that we can.
And it's not to suggest that anybody's perception was wrong. It's just understanding their perception is their perception based on a whole bunch of human factors. And now what you're doing is you're taking the human factors out and just looking at the evidence and applying scientific principles to that to provide a greater understanding of what most likely happened.
Absolutely. We're typically hired for the what happened question, but the human factors, we dovetail very well with that because the human factors can usually explain the why it happened that way. And so, there is a part of our practice that covers human factors, but our core competency is biomechanics, and we usually get dovetailed with a human factors expert, and we'll work together to piece together not only what happened, but why it happened as well.
It seems to me another critical piece here is that this is all technology that exists, has been proven, as there's papers published on it. It's used in a number of
Mhm,
other fields. So it's not just something you just
mhm.
pulled out to try and justify something. You're taking existing science that's used in other elements that has been proven and then applying it to the science of violence. Is that accurate?
That is 100% accurate, especially true with the shape recognition. Less true with inverse photogrammetry. I feel like forensics, uh, I, I may be wrong on the history here, but I believe uh, inverse photogrammetry was born of forensic application.
Okay.
And that started probably 10 years ago, 5, 10 years ago, with the onset of some very savvy engineers. And so I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. We haven't done anything new, but I like to think that we've taken it several steps further in the sense that um, locating where that officer is and figuring out biomechanically what their orientations are in that three-dimensional space.
And such a critical piece. So, are there other areas or cases where you've used this inverse photogrammetry to determine body orientation and position, or do you want to move on and talk about determining force from videos?
Um, there are other files that we've used. For example, this is an interesting one. As you know, there's a lot of action camera uh, video out there as well, like GoPros. Everybody's recording themselves on GoPros, and they attach it to their head, their chin, their chest, their bike, whatever they're doing. And and so we have a lot of accident footage from GoPros, and that's another way that we can use this. And sometimes the GoPros facing towards the person, sometimes it's facing towards the environment, and we got into a very hefty lawsuit with a manufacturer. This was on the plaintiff side, and I won't get into details, but inverse photogrammetry became absolutely critical on that file in determining the impact angle because the forks of his bike had fractured fully, and that caused him to nosedive into the ground and cause a very serious spinal cord injury. And so without the use of inverse photogrammetry, we would have never been able to determine that. And nobody else on the file had approached it that way. And because of that, we were able to be successful in defending that person's actions.
And with some of these cases, the officer might have body camera, but again, depending on where the body is oriented, so the officer's body may be oriented one way, the threat may be coming from another direction, or it might be a vehicle coming, or they might be shooting in another direction. So is that something where you have the body camera looking in one direction, but you might have other camera footage from other angles, and now you can pull all of this and match it all together?
I tend to agree, yes. And we see that a lot, especially as the officer goes to shoot or goes to perform an action. You'll get a lot of blading of the torso, or what you might see is the body camera being occluded somehow
Right.
because they're dipping their chin a little bit to engage their sights, which might occlude the body worn camera. But all of that can be pieced together with the human factors or perhaps with a firearms expert that could help explain why the officer was doing it at that time. And we actually have a law enforcement advisor that we work with closely to help us with things like that. And why would the officer be doing this at this time? Because we know that he is. We just don't know why he is doing it this way, and we might get explanations that way. And we start to piece together holistically, um, you know, what was happening and what decisions were actually being made. But it all starts from understanding what actually happened.
Absolutely. Excellent. So let's talk about determining force from video, because again, I think this is one of those areas where, people say, well, the officer overreact or to use too much force based on a whole variety of things. It might be injury to the subject, or it might be other elements, or just somebody's perception. Talk about how you determine force from video then using some of the technology.
And I just want to clarify for your audience that when I say force, force is a term that's used a lot in law enforcement, and not to be confused with use of force and as a means to control your subject. I actually mean like load. I mean weight. I mean the application of poundage to a person. How do we extract that from video? And we've done it a couple ways, Brian. One, more simply, is just using Newton's second law. It just happened to be the way we approach this one file, but there was a takedown that was witnessed by a halo camera. And so we got a fairly sagittal plane view. And what I mean by sagittal plane is just side view of this incident. And the officer took a person to the ground. And during that incident, there was a large 11-centimeter laceration that occurred to that subject's head. And so the immediate conclusion was that it was excessive force, except the statement from the officer was like, look, I didn't know who this person was. My focus was on the uniformed officers behind me. I thought he was an accomplice of the person that was being arrested. I was just reacting and wanted to get this guy to the ground. I didn't have a good grip on him. One of my feet slipped from under me. And so at best, I was about half my overall strength was being applied. And we're like, well, isn't that interesting? Let's take a look at this. And through just Newton's second law, we could measure, which is just force, physical force, equals the mass of the object moving times its acceleration. That's all Newton's second law is. It's a grade 10 math, but the expertise comes is applying it to a video like this. And so we have a mass of the person that was being taken down. We can measure their acceleration in the video. And so we have the mass because he was weighed at the hospital. We have the acceleration from the video. And so from that, we can calculate force. Now, what does that force mean? Where is the spectrum here from 0 effort and 100% effort? Where does this force calculation now lie? That was the secret, and that's where we had to turn to testing. And so that's literally what we did. Is we went to testing. We had a subject, an officer, hold a dummy that was the same weight as the person in the video, and we said, okay, we want you to just hold this person and fall to the ground. Use as little amount of effort to take this dummy to the ground as possible. And we measure, same thing, measure the acceleration. And then on the next set of trials, we said, okay, we want you to take this dummy down as fast and as hard as you can. Okay, and then we measured that acceleration. So now we had our scale, if you will, like a 0 to 100% scale. And what we found was what we measured in the incident video fell anywhere between 36 and 52% of maximum effort, which was very, very consistent with officer statements. And that was, communicated to the jury, and there was actually a defense verdict in that particular file based on that analysis.
Excellent. So is part of this that it's hard when people look at the video and it's hard to determine that simply from looking at the video. People look at the injury. Head injuries tend to bleed a lot, so there's blood all over the place and it looks pretty catastrophic. And again, this person turned out not to be actively involved, but the officer didn't know that at the time. So does this help to take, again, does this go back to help take some of the emotion out of it and some of the subjectivity out of it, and now show people from a more scientific standpoint that this was simply within this range, as opposed to them believing that it might be some kind of a WWE body slam at 100% that caused this injury?
100%. I mean, it's unfortunate that the injury occurred, and that's one thing that we can't get around, is the injury actually did occur. But what was being said about the officer's intent was very different than what had actually occurred. And so being able to just show that, quantitatively, I think that's the secret. Honestly, I really do find the courts like to see the numbers, or if you can place a number to it, then they feel that you understand it to a greater degree. And it just so happened that those numbers agreed, or at least were consistent with officer statements, and that was enough to cast doubt on what the plaintiff was saying. And so they really couldn't prove their case from that. And so it's objective, it's quantitative, it's powerful. And while it's unfortunate the injury occurred, it certainly wasn't due to the officer's intent.
And that becomes such a critical piece. And it seems to me it goes back to the perception from the subject, who in this case was injured. And probably the way that he's going to describe it is the officer body slammed me. So the language now becomes inflammatory and people get this image in their head. So even with all of these examples, it seems, as you said, that the key is to qualitatively and objectively present information to whoever the triers of fact are, so that they can make a better decision based on that quantitative and objective information.
Agreed. Last thing we want to do, Brian, is get inside the officer's head or somehow support him without using that objective information, because all of a sudden we've lost all credibility at that point.
Right. So you come at this as somebody who's there to help educate the court as a scientist, as opposed to, you're not taking sides in this. You're just there to take the information, use this technology and your deep background in biomechanics, and then help to educate the court as to what most likely occurred based on the science.
Correct. That's exactly what we do. We're more there on behalf of the court than we are for any one side of the bench, but we just try to present the most accurate and objective information that we have available to us. And if there's information missing, then we try to fill that information with testing. And that testing will be performed according to scientific and engineering standards, and then we present that as we would any other set of results.
So do you find then that the courts are perhaps more receptive to this, that it's not some cop and nothing, and I don't mean that in a derogatory manner, but they see you as a scientist as opposed to a brother or sister law enforcement professional, and you're coming in as a scientist to provide the scientific and engineering foundations to the information that you have to present this information. Do you find that the court looks at that as being perhaps less biased than perhaps other experts?
Well, that's actually a complex question, Brian, because I'd have to say yes and no, in the sense that if it is an officer on the stand, I think the general sense is like, well, of course he's going to support his coworker. So being a scientist and engineer can be helpful in that respect, and in the sense that I think most people would view us as independent. However, it's very, very easy to lose your audience if you get too technical.
All right.
And so you have to be very, very careful on how you explain this information and the level of detail that you're giving it, and don't get off topic. And what I mean by that is I always encourage lawyers, never ever give a jury more than 3 pieces of information. And on direct examination, all the questions should be going at deriving those 3 pieces of information and making it as clear as possible to them. And then my job on cross is obviously not to get tripped up, but also to reiterate those 3 pieces of information as I'm being questioned, to say, yes, but, or no, but, and then hammer home those 3 pieces of information. And that's maximum. I prefer 1 or 2, to be honest.
And it would seem to me
because
that that's a tremendous skill to take the science, which is very in-depth and potentially very complex, but present it in a way that's as simple as possible. No simpler, but simple enough for the layperson, for all of us to be able to understand and go, okay, that makes sense, as opposed to you lost me like an hour ago. And that would seem
that's
to me to be a tremendous skill to be able to do that, to present that information in a simple way, still preserving the integrity of the science.
I would agree with you, and it's been our number one hurdle since day one, is to just get across to people what we do, how we do it, and what problems we can solve for them.
So where do you see the future then of the biomechanics analysis from video, from body-worn cameras and other video? What do you see in the future for how this you can expand some of this to use in different ways?
Well, everything's going 3 dimensions, and it's doing that for several reasons. I think one, that you can visualize things just better, even if it's just taking them through the scene, doing a fly through of the scene, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're in if you can go from 2D to 3D quantitatively, now you've got a world of that virtual reality that you can literally step through frame by frame. And that's where I think this is going to go. I think that eventually, we may even have virtual reality goggles in the courtroom, where the jury gets to try on all of these goggles at the same time, and the expert can walk them through this 3-dimensional environment that they've built. I strongly believe that that's where all of this video analysis is going to end up, and it'll be quantitative, and it'll be with known error rates, and you might even have segments of that virtual reality where some frames you don't see anything because there's no information there to fill in those gaps, but then as soon as the information is provided, you can see it again, and you can justify or reason how that what might be placed in that missing piece of information by, say, a transparent body instead of a non-transparent body. Do you see what I'm saying? So
Right.
it's like, here we're 95% confident in all of this, and then when we get here, we're only about 50% confidence. We're going to perhaps gray that out or make it translucent or what have you. And then as we get more confident again, we can go back in, and it just allows the jury to fully understand in terms that as a human are just easy to absorb. That's what needs to be done. That's where this is going, and I think we're close to getting there. And that kind of stems from, if I could just give one more example, Brian,
Yep.
of force from video. Instead of using Newton's second law, we can use entire 3D models. And the way we do this is we have biomechanical models. Okay, so these aren't simulations. These aren't a graphic artist's interpretation or anything like that. These are actually models that are designed in vehicle safety tests and things like that. You can run a new design in these models, and we'll use those exact same models and then move it so that it matches the 2D image that we're seeing frame by frame by frame. And what that allows us to do is we can now take biomechanical measurements. And so the justification there is that if we can get this 3D model to respond similarly to what we're seeing in the 2D video, then the biomechanical measurements it's giving us should be valid. Okay, that's a technique that we're still developing. We're doing some research on that right now, but I should let your audience know that we've used that several times in several officer use of force files. It's been very useful, and just know that we're improving the process. But what that now essentially does is allows you, like, once you've matched that 3-dimensional model's movement over that 2D frame by frame image from whatever video captured the incident. Now we can do away with the video, the 2D video, and work primarily in the three-dimensional environment and start pulling, you know, injury probabilities and things of this nature, and what force was applied to the body to make it move that way. That's where I think the real magic lies, and that is an expensive piece of software. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, and it's an expensive piece of software, and it takes a deep understanding of the science. But the potential for what you're doing is so huge, and just helping us understand what actually happened from a scientific standpoint. So so many great things on the horizon. Now, if people want to find out more about what you offer through GTD Scientific, because you not only offer your consulting services, but you offer training programs, you do in-person presentations, but you also have online training. So if people want to find out more or look at accessing some of the training that you have around the science of violence, what's the best way for people to do that, Jeff?
Oh, best way to do it is just go to our website, which is www.gtdscientific.com, and go to the Science of Violence courses, which is on our homepage, and you'll see the various modalities that we offer. So webinars, in person. We might even post where we're teaching next. We were at ILEETA this year, as you know, Brian. We're at IACP. We were at the Vancouver Use of Force Expert Conference recently. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It just, you know, you just need to choose what is best for you. We've also got online courses that are already pre-recorded, and they're not, you know, this is not where we make our money. They're not expensive at all. It's and obviously if it's coming from a group site, like say an agency wants to do a group viewing, we can certainly come up with group pricing as well. Just give us a shout.
Excellent. And I would encourage people to certainly check that out. And obviously, if you're going to be at ILEETA conferences in the future, Jeff and GTD Scientific are huge supporters of ILEETA, in addition to the presentations that he does there to help educate us about these. So, Jeff, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for carving time out of your very busy schedule. I know you have another commitment coming up in a few minutes, so I appreciate you carving time out of your very busy schedule. But more importantly, I want to thank you for all of the important work that you have done and continue to do in this area of the science of violence to help us understand from a scientific perspective the realities in a quantitative and objective way as to what's happening in these situations. And you do a very good job of breaking it down so that those of us that are not scientists and never made it out of grade 10 science can certainly understand some of these principles. So for everything you have done, everything you continue to do, thank you so much for your passion and your contributions and your commitment and for your service.
Well, thank you, Brian, for allowing us to and helping us communicate it. That's, like I say, that's always been our number one issue. So the fact that you're interested and reach out to us and do these podcasts is much appreciated to help get the word out.
That's certainly my pleasure. And so to the members of the Excellence at Training Academy community, as always, I encourage you to let the information that Jeff shared, and he shared a lot of important information, let that information simmer, percolate overnight, and then be intentional about sitting down tomorrow, writing out your greatest takeaways, writing out your action steps. What actions are you going to take to put this into motion? And one of the actions I would suggest you take is go to their website and look at doing some of the training programs or bringing Jeff in to do some training for you. So for the Excellence in Training Academy community, as always, I thank you for your commitment to excellence both in and through training. Always continue to train hard, train smart, train with passion and purpose, and always be willing to dare to be great.